Whenever we modern viewers look back at ancient Egypt, a host of images, stereotypes, and assumptions often comes to mind. An obsession with death, people dressed in little more than loincloths, and a general absence of modern comforts. Yet despite a civilization that spanned over 3,000 years and included numerous dynasties, visitors to any era in ancient Egypt would still find several familiar sights. In reality, much of what we think we know about ancient Egypt is informed by misconceptions passed down through word of mouth, outdated textbooks, and pop culture influences. Today we're going to explore 5 surprising ways that life in ancient Egypt wasn't exactly what you might expect. One of the biggest misconceptions about ancient culture is the belief that they lacked a sense of fun. Although we're all human, we often imagine the ancients as somber, survival-focused groups with little time for leisure. In reality, the ancient Egyptians were anything but dull. They embraced games and festivities of every kind, weaving entertainment into the very fabric of their daily lives. One of those popular board games in ancient Egypt was called Senet. Played on a lengthy board divided into 30 painted squares, Senet involved moving pieces based on the outcomes of dice rolls or the casting of sticks. Although historians still debate the exact rules of the game, its popularity is absolutely undeniable. Pharaohs like Tutankhamun were even buried with their Senet boards. Yes, and it was not the only game enjoyed by the Egyptians. Other games such as Mehen and Hounds and Jackals, which bears a resemblance to the modern game of Chutes and Ladders, or Snakes and Ladders if you're feeling particularly British, were widespread across Europe to the point where knowing how to play them was almost essential for one's social life. Beyond board games, the ancient Egyptians also held a deep appreciation for sports. Swimming was perhaps the most popular pastime, inspiring a variety of water-related activities such as rowing and even water jousting, and that is exactly what it sounds like. They also enjoyed an array of land games, including gymnastics and tug-of-wars, as well as contact sports like handball and a primitive form of field hockey that featured sticks made from palm branches. Still, all of these games paled in comparison to the festivals and celebrations of ancient Egypt. Much like today, the ancient Egyptians embraced nearly any excuse to throw a party, be it for birthdays, funerals, housewarmings, and just about everything else in between. Festivals, on the other hand, they were grander affairs. They were held to honor the birthdays of gods, the interactions between deities and humans, the deeds of great kings, and other significant religious or cultural events. The way each festival was celebrated varied according to its purpose, as did the appropriate attire. Yet nearly all shared 2 common elements: abundant food and abundant alcohol. The Egyptians, credited with popularizing beer, made drinking a central part of every celebration. And there were many celebrations. Ancient Egypt officially recognized over 40 religious festivals, each lasting anywhere from 1 to 15 days, not to mention countless personal and state-sponsored events. Now, when we think of ancient warriors, Egypt is rarely the first civilization that comes to mind. Despite its extensive military history, which includes significant conquests and an innovative police force, Egypt is often overshadowed by more widely recognized warrior cultures like the Spartans and the Romans. During the Old Kingdom and well into the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptian military operated much like a feudal system of medieval Europe. Regional governors, known as nomarchs, raised militaries in times of need. This structure changed dramatically at the beginning of the 12th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom, when Amenemhet, circa 1991 to 1962 BC, undertook significant military reforms. He established a standing army, curtailed the power of the nomarchs, and firmly placed the military under the centralized control of the pharaoh. Following these reforms, the Egyptian military evolved into a structured system led by upper-class officers and composed of a lower-class, rank-and-file soldiers, though opportunities for advancement through service did exist. For many years, the reorganized force primarily focused on defending Egypt's borders and protecting its vital resources. However, everything changed dramatically with the expulsion of the Hyksos, foreign rulers who had occupied Lower Egypt for over a century. Their defeat ushered in the New Kingdom, the period unlike any before it, and born out of warfare. Drawing on the military technologies left behind by the Hyksos, the Egyptians refined innovations such as scimitars, composite bows, and horse-drawn chariots. Armed with these advancements and supported by a now professional army, pharaohs like Thutmose III, 1458 to 1425 BC, and Ramesses II, 1279 to 1213 BC, led numerous campaigns to expand Egypt's territory and influence. During this era, Egypt emerged as a formidable power on the international stage, facing challengers like the Hittites and making significant inroads into regions such as Mesopotamia. While military expansion was commonplace in the ancient world, Egypt also emerged as an early innovator in a less expected field: law enforcement. Remarkably, the concept of policing in Egypt predates even the Old Kingdom, with evidence of organized law enforcement reaching back to 3000 BC. At that time, the country was divided into administrative districts, each overseen by an official responsible for maintaining law and security within their region. These officials were supported by figures known as the Chief of Hitters, individuals tasked with duties such as tax collection and the enforcement of local regulations. In essence, these primitive police chiefs managed teams of law enforcers, laying the foundation for some of the earliest forms of organized policing in human history. As Egypt advanced into the Old Kingdom, pharaohs and nobles began employing Nubian warriors who had already strengthened the military ranks as personal guards for their estates, tombs, and valuables. Over time, these guards evolved into the famed Nubian Medjay, a group now deeply embedded in modern portrayals of ancient Egypt. Their reputation as elite protectors was cemented after Amenhotep I reformed the military and police systems, transforming the Medjay into a highly trained security force. At the head stood the chief of the Medjay, under whose leadership officers received comprehensive training in judicial procedures, combat, tracking, and other vital skills. These officers oversaw public spaces, investigated crimes, apprehended suspects, and carried out many of the same duties as modern police forces. In addition to bows, they were equipped with non-lethal weapons such as wooden staffs and slingshots, tools that proved particularly effective for crowd control. Now, surprisingly, much like today's police forces, ancient Egyptian officers were assisted by animal companions. Dogs, for instance, were commonly employed to guard royal tombs, sacred sites, and other sensitive areas. They also helped track suspects and recover stolen goods, and their frequent depiction in tomb art attests to their importance. Monkeys, known for their agility, were utilized for market patrols, where they could swiftly move through crowds and apprehend suspects. Remarkably, ancient Egypt not only Sorry. It's the monkey police. Remarkably, what the f***? How do you train a monkey? I'm sure you can. Remarkably, ancient Egypt not only pioneered one of the earliest known police forces, but also established a model for law enforcement duties that would echo throughout history. Officers who were responsible for safely transporting prisoners to court and played various roles during legal proceedings, serving as prosecutors, investigators, bailiffs, and more. Of all the misconceptions and preconceived notions about ancient Egypt, few... Fuck, man, get your shit together. Few are as widespread or as hotly debated as the issue of slavery. Bible accounts suggest that the Israelites were enslaved almost exclusively by the Egyptians. Meanwhile, others claim that slaves built the pyramids, a belief often attributed to Herodotus, the so-called father of history. Today, however, both theories are largely dismissed, the former as a mythologized origin narrative and the latter as an attempt to explain how such monumental achievements could have been possible. Modern historians and archaeologists now contend that the pyramids were constructed by a well-organized workforce made up of skilled laborers, architects, and builders who were highly valued and properly compensated. Still, given what we know about slavery in ancient Egypt, it seems unlikely that slaves played no role whatsoever in the construction of the pyramids. The history of slavery in Egypt, much like the origins of policing, predates the Old Kingdom and manifested in various early forms of servitude. While one might consider the peasantry of the time, serfs bound to work the lands for their nomarchs or the pharaoh, as a type of slaves, here we focus on the most overt and historically documented form: prisoners of war. During the Old Kingdom, captives from neighboring regions such as Nubia and Libya were brought to Egypt and forced into lifelong labor. However, enslavement was not limited to foreigners. Egyptians themselves could fall into bondage due to financial mismanagement or insurmountable debt. Similarly, officials who abused their power might be subjected to servitude as a form of public punishment and humiliation. At this stage in history, most slaves were considered state property, explicitly owned by the pharaoh, and assigned various duties, with some even conscripted into military service. As Egypt transitioned into the Middle Kingdom, records show that the state increasingly relied on a wider range of labor sources, including fugitives, conscripts, and raw laborers, to carry out its projects. By this period, slaves were no longer confined solely to forced labor. They also served as household servants, field hands, cobblers, hairdressers, and took on nearly every other occupation. While it is unlikely that slaves led or managed the construction of the pyramids, the broad scope of their roles makes it difficult to assert that they had no involvement whatsoever. Given the scale and complexity of such projects, it's reasonable to assume that slaves contributed in some capacity, even if only in a minor supporting role. Now, with the advent of the New Kingdom, Egypt's approach to slavery began to evolve. Slaves were no longer confined solely to the service of the pharaoh or temple institutions. Instead, they became accessible to a wider segment of the elite and were employed on a much larger scale. During this period, Egypt took a more active role in the slave trade, frequently purchasing slaves from the Bedouins, even though many had already been acquired through military conquests. Slaves could be rented out much like tools or livestock, and they were sometimes granted to elites and dignitaries as a form of state-sponsored reward. It was also during the New Kingdom that slaves started to gain limited rights, such as the possibility of earning citizenship, typically through marriage to an Egyptian or through extended service in a temple. Although slavery did remain a widespread and deeply embedded institution in ancient Egypt, it never quite resembled the portrayals found in biblical narratives, the writings of Herodotus, or indeed modern pop culture. So, whenever the topic of women's rights in history arises, one consensus tends to emerge regardless of the time period, the location, or the culture. Women generally had very few, if any, rights. While one could debate technicalities endlessly, the reality remains that for women, the past was pretty darn bleak. However, ancient Egypt stands out as a notable exception. Women there, across all social classes, enjoyed rights and privileges that wouldn't be seen again until the 21st century, and even then, not always to the same extent. As expected, royal women were typically exempt from childcare and household duties, which were handled by slaves or servants. Their roles often paralleled those of their husbands, involving responsibilities such as receiving foreign dignitaries, shaping policy, and participating in governance. Although it was uncommon for women to rule as pharaohs in their own right, at least 6 of them did, with some historians suggesting there may have been as many as 12 throughout ancient Egypt's 3,000-year history. Upper-class women likely spent somewhat more time caring for their children, although their lifestyles still closely resembled those of royalty, with a household staffed by slaves and servants. Even though these women were often married off, it was considered disrespectful to send them outside of Egypt. Consequently, while their husbands might be foreign men brought into Egypt, the women themselves were rarely sent abroad. This practice stands in stark contrast to later European royal traditions. Lower-class women, by contrast, were more directly involved in raising their children and managing the household. However, this division of labor did not necessarily imply a subservient role. Rather, it often represented a partnership with their husbands, who typically worked outside the home. Although men held the formal title of head of household, women across all social classes were generally regarded as equals within the marriage. They had the option to work outside the home, and while most lower-class women did not take that option, nearly all professions were technically open to them, with equal pay to their male counterparts. Now, while there's no evidence that women served in the military, they did participate in nearly every other sector, including roles as priests and doctors. Women could own property, they could run businesses, they could manage land. They held the legal right to initiate divorce, remarry at will, and enter into contracts independently, regardless of the other parties involved. Remarkably, ancient Egyptian women even had access to abortion, a common and accepted medical practice at the time. Now, many of us enjoy imagining what it would be like to travel back to ancient times and envision the lives we might lead. Yet one universal concern often gives us pause. Medical care in the ancient world was generally pretty f***ing terrible. After all, modern science allows us to reset bones, understand the heart, and perform safe surgeries. Well, surprisingly, the ancient Egyptians were actually pretty darn advanced at medicine. Now, at the time, most illnesses were thought to be divine punishments or messages from the gods. Consequently, much medical knowledge was recorded in religious texts. Literacy, however, was limited. Modern scholars estimate that only 1 to 5% of the population could read, and some even speculate that the percentage was lower than that. Before the New Kingdom, priestly duties rotated among educated civil servants who served for only a few months at a time. During the New Kingdom, however, a dedicated priestly class emerged. These priests were required to undergo scribal training, which made them literate and capable of reading medical texts. Although not all scribes were priests, from this point on, all priests were expected to be scribes. Their literacy allowed them to access writings on ailments, surgical procedures, dentistry, and a lot more. By the time of Herodotus, Egypt had earned a reputation for exceptional medical expertise. According to Herodotus himself, to quote him, "The practice of medicine is so divided among Egyptians that each physician is a healer of one disease and no more. All the country is full of physicians, some of the eye, some of the teeth, some of what pertains to the belly, and some of the hidden diseases." End quote. Now, by this time, Egyptian doctors had not only earned a reputation for their medical skill, but had begun specializing in certain areas of study, much like modern physicians. although their understanding was not perfect, for example, they believed that the heart was the source of all bodily fluids, the medical advancements of ancient Egypt remain undeniably impressive. They correctly identified the heart's function and recognized 2 types of blood vessels, and they were the first to document cerebrospinal fluid. Their detailed knowledge of the circulatory, nervous, and respiratory systems, among others, as well as their understanding of various diseases, was remarkably advanced and would not be matched for thousands of years. Perhaps most astonishing, though, was their ability to apply this knowledge in a surgical context. Using materials commonly available at the time, reeds, woods, and plant fibers, the ancient Egyptians developed and routinely used a variety of surgical tools that remain recognizable today. Scalpels, forceps, scissors, and more. All of these implements were available to them. With these instruments, they performed procedures ranging from basic wound cauterization and suturing to more complex operations such as draining abscesses, boils, and infected wounds. The methods even included a technique similar to modern casting in which they wrapped the broken limbs in linen soaked with a sticky substance that hardened to provide support. In a world where much of ancient life feels alien or harsh, ancient Egypt stands out as a place where even a modern visitor might find a surprising amount of familiarity, especially when it comes to medicine. Thank you for watching.